Right guys, how's it going? At the end of my Radeon 7 review and analysis, belated video, after yet another incompetence-filled release which rehashed years-old problems plaguing them, I made this plea to the Radeon Technologies Group. We really need to talk, Radeon Technologies Group. I feel that I can help you fix a lot of these issues that you're having, both with your hardware and with the tech press. I've got ideas that I am reasonably sure will work. I read all the comments in all of my videos, and I respond to many of them. One in particular in this video caught my eye. Good video, but it's awfully arrogant to say that you can help them with the software and hardware, as if they don't know what they are working with and what they are doing. When things like the launch of this card happens, I often think this is a prime example of corporate espionage/sabotage. How could anyone possibly let this happen? And I respond with, let me ask you a question. Would you have mentioned this automatic undervolt in the reviewer's guide they provided to the press? The response being, yes, of course, but on the other hand, they should just make undervolting the default. Now, normally I would continue to argue, but this was just so cute that I just hearted the comment and decided to move on instead. Now, to recap undervolting quickly. Undervolting the GPU means that you go into AMD's Wattman program, which is under performance and tuning. And now if I select manual, GPU tuning enabled, and then advanced control enabled, and we can see here the voltage frequency curve of my Radeon 7. Clicking on fine tuning controls, we can see the exact frequencies and their corresponding voltages, of which there are 3. So 738 millivolts is the base frequency of 808 MHz. The middle frequency of 1304 MHz has a corresponding voltage of 805 millivolts, and the maximum 3D clock, that's 1801 MHz, has a corresponding voltage of 1100 millivolts. When you game or put the card under a heavy 3D load, the card attempts to maximise this frequency at 1801 MHz, and it ramps up the voltage to 1100 millivolts. Other AMD cards go up even as far as 1200 millivolts. And if I recall correctly, I think my Vega Liquid was 1250 millivolts at max. Undervolting basically means you take this final number and then you lower it until you can continue to play every game without any crashes or artifacting or other deleterious effects. But why do that? Well, simply put, this lower maximum voltage means that the card wastes less power, meaning that it doesn't heat up so much during gaming, and therefore has less requirement to ramp up fans to higher levels in order to keep it cool. You save power and the card is less noisy. Now, automatic undervolting was first seen in Wattman with the Radeon 7's release. It's still here under auto-tuning and undervolt GPU. And as soon as I caught wind of this feature, I instantly tested it and decided that it would be part of my review. I also had a look through the Radeon 7 reviewer's guide to see what they were saying about this cool new feature, and I found absolutely nothing. Not one single mention of the auto-undervolt feature in the entire press deck or reviewer's guide. As usual, I relayed my frustrations to AMD PR, and I got the usual nod of agreement back. And when you look at the viewer's perspective again, with that knowledge, it does add an element of hilarity to the discussion. I showed how both the automatic undervolt and also manually undervolting worked on my Radeon 7 review video, and there were some very large savings in power draw and much less noise for the exact same performance as before. So in fact, the question to ask is, why wouldn't you undervolt? There's essentially no good reason not to. And if I search for the term auto-undervolt in the video comments, I can clearly see how much of a big deal that this feature was, based on the sheer number of people talking about it. Yet there was literally nobody else in the entire tech press talked about this feature. And I guess it's hard to blame them when the feature isn't even mentioned in any of the press materials. But for me, with 2 simple clicks, the unplayably noisy Radeon 7, which was derided in the press, now became tolerable. In this particular instance of the auto-undervolt feature, it is rather obvious that the Radeon Technologies Group is unaware with what they are working with and what they are doing. And the viewer's perspective of course, is also quite telling. To an enthusiast, such an option should be so obviously beneficial as to be clearly part of the press materials. This person didn't even consider that it wouldn't be. Furthermore, and in agreement with many others who commented in the video, they believe that automatic undervolt should be the default setting in the drivers. However, simply automatic undervolting in the drivers and leaving it at that can't be a workable fix. Otherwise, RTG would surely have employed that fix a long time ago. Surely. One reason for why they haven't could be that differences in silicon quality and also card build quality, and I'm looking at you, Asus, means that some cards could be unstable because of the undervolt, which ends up in an RMA which nobody wants. Previous to starting on YouTube, I ran a small business as a system builder and exporter, and every return basically wiped out my entire profit on a PC. So I absolutely understand the need for stability above all else. Having automatic undervolt as a default driver setting isn't a viable option unless activation costs less than 1% return rate. In my Something Wrong at Radeon video, my original one from 2.5 years ago, I criticised the Radeon Technologies Group over their penchant for pushing cards past their sweet spot while simultaneously strapping on underpowered cooling solutions. This hot and loud meme that has followed RTG's graphics cards since around 2013 is a result of multiple questionable design choices for years on end. And though I say questionable, in many ways their hands have been tied. With every new architecture, they have to release a reference card first. If they had GPU samples going out to Taiwan, the performance would be leaked almost instantly, which is why all new architectures launch with reference cards. Why doesn't RTG create their own expensive cooling solution then? Well, we saw what happened with Fury X and the Vega Liquid. Those cards were water-cooled and a bit too expensive. Fury X was plagued with pump noise, and the Vega Liquid was practically unbuyable at the same price as the 1080 Ti. It's easy for Nvidia to slap on a better cooling solution and charge $100 more. RTG needs to cut corners, and historically, the cooling solutions they provide with their reference cards just aren't enough to adequately cool their GPUs after they again decide to ramp up the clock speeds late in the day. Reference Hawaii was the original hot and loud. Reference Polaris throttled. It couldn't hold its clock speeds. Reference Vega was hot, loud and slow. And now Reference Navi, while it's been a definite improvement over Vega, as you can see, it is still absolutely nowhere near the equivalent G-forces in terms of acoustic performance. 54 decibels, I could not handle that. It's easy for Nvidia, but it's a tough situation for the Radeon Technologies Group to be in. A real catch-22 of not being able to afford better cooling solutions, yet the lack of such is helping to keep their value proposition that much lower than Nvidia's. So I started thinking about solutions to this problem, and the first thing I did was ask myself, what would Nvidia do in this same situation? And I came up with the blatantly anti-consumer idea of making Auto-undervolt the default option in the press drivers. When reviewing a new graphics card, we get various press drivers and a bunch of other materials that aren't for normal downloading on the company's website. And this press driver practice, I am not particularly happy about it, as it seems open to abuse, the kind of which I am now going to detail. And I figured that, given how little attention was paid to automatic undervolting during the reviews of the Radeon 7, it's highly unlikely that any of them would have noticed. That hot and loud card would have been received far more favourably in the tech press. But wait a minute, what if the press gets a card that isn't a great undervolter and it crashes or is otherwise unstable due to bad silicon or a badly built card? Now, before I continue, I'm aware that in the past I've called out certain companies for dubious behaviour regarding seeding golden samples to the tech press, and Intel's Con Lake was a golden example of that. However, make no mistake about it, if I were in PR or marketing at any company, I too would be sending out my very best products to reviewers. I absolutely would, and I didn't at any time suggest otherwise. I was simply pointing out that this is very likely what is going on. And the Radeon Technologies Group should have been sending out the best samples to the tech press. So bad quality silicon, that shouldn't really be an issue with any of these graphics cards. They should also be tested before being sent out, and in fact I'm pretty sure they are. And they should also have been undervolted in the press driver. This is the kind of thing that Nvidia would do if faced with the same issues. And the more I thought about it, the more I realised that it needs to be done without even notifying the press, or indeed, without giving any indication that the cards are running with this automatic undervolt. And in fact, I decided to go ahead and suggest this clearly anti-consumer move to a handful of people within AMD. And every time it's been met with the same kind of response. We can't do that. We'd be slaughtered if we got caught, etc, etc. Obviously, that is understandable. But I just couldn't help but wonder how the idea would have been met at Nvidia. The last time I discussed this Auto-undervolt con with somebody within the Radeon Technologies Group, they said that auto-undervolting in the press driver was a good idea, but that it should also be noted in the reviewer's guide. I instantly disagreed with that because I know that doing this would simply end up with them being called out for an obvious con. Telling the press about it simply would not work. The first thing the press would do would be ask the Radeon Technologies Group if this is the default for how the cards would ship. The answer to which, of course, is no. And that was as far as any of my discussions on this whole automatic undervolting topic got with anyone inside of AMD. I never gave anyone my further plans for this because I was seeing an awful lot of fight back against the idea as soon as any element of dishonesty was introduced. But I'll give you my follow-up plans, and I'll start by going back to my previous point. What if the card crashes for a reviewer? Surely that could be a giveaway. Well, the fact here is that during the review process, we are in constant contact with marketing and PR. Doesn't matter what company. And they will ask us if everything's alright with the card and what's our general feeling, that kind of thing. And quite often I will instigate discussions with them by asking stuff like, is anybody else having X, Y or Z problem? And every time the answer is no, which I don't really believe. So somebody in the press for some reason got a rather mediocre card, which crashed because of the hidden automatic undervolt. The simplest solution would be to tell them a predetermined tale, like only marketing can do. For example, yeah, we heard of one other reviewer who had a problem. Seems they had something screwy with the voltages, which they fixed by going into Whatman, selecting the tuning tab and clicking on default. And doing that would of course set the voltages back to these normal levels that the Radeon Technologies Group would ship the cards to customers. And that would presumably fix any instability. And of course this single reviewer who got the dodgy card would then have slightly higher power consumption and a noisier card than most. But that still seems a lot better than all the reviewers getting slightly higher power draw and noisier cards. And by this point I'm in my full anti-consumer mode now, and I started looking deeper at how this auto-undervolt con could work, or if there are any obvious pitfalls. And in fact, the entire Whatman UI already looks near perfectly set up to get away with this. If I just reset Whatman right back to the factory reset, and again under tuning we see it's under automatic and default. But if you actually click on manual, and then click on automatic again, the default tab is no longer selected. In fact, nothing is. This is how it could be for the press driver out of the box. So it looks exactly like this in the press driver. Nothing selected under the auto tuning, but there is a special hidden automatic undervolt voltage of say 1050 millivolts applied, so long as it looks like this. And remember, if the card crashes for the reviewer, which it shouldn't, but if it did, the marketing simply relays to them that it's just because of a little bug in the driver. The solution is simply by clicking on default. There is absolutely zero indication that the card is undervolted, and in fact this undervolt GPU option, which it is now called, should be left there. And if that is then clicked by the reviewer, as we're about to see, it drops down to 1040 millivolts. So it is actually still undervolting a little bit further than the secret undervolt of say 1050 millivolts. The chances of anyone in the press discovering this would have been close to zero. Remember, nobody even tested automatic undervolt during the Radeon 7 review. And if anyone did suspect something, there is a whole lot of plausible deniability. It's simply a bug, you simply need to click on default. And to be frank, nobody in the press would even know what the default shipping voltages actually were anyway. How would they know if RTG are shipping at 1050 millivolts or 1100 millivolts? It'd only be seen later with consumer reference cards. And again, that same buggy press driver excuse continues to work. I mean, sure, by this point, there'll be a few alarm bells ringing. But by that point, the cards will have been reviewed, and the first impression is the one that counts. By this point, I was thinking, Jim, you sneaky, you could have worked for Nvidia in another life. A couple of months ago, I had a chat with an RTG engineer. I didn't get any leaks on what is coming next. However, I got one piece of very interesting information. I was curious as to why, exactly, Radeon cards ship with such high voltages when they clearly undervolt by a lot. And note that that isn't always true, by the way, because my Vega Liquid could only undervolt by 10 millivolts before it crashed. But that was because the card was pushed to the absolute limits. It had zero overclockability and zero undervoltability. But in general, most AMD GPUs have either headroom for a reasonable overclock with a reasonable cooler, or you get a very nice undervolt. The answer I got surprised me, as I had long assumed that the main reason for it is that by ramping up the voltages, more of the GPUs on the wafer can pass the higher speed bins. So for example, by ramping it up to 1.2 volts, you get more 5700 XTs on a single wafer. However, when you consider the recent 5600 XT release and its very low clock speeds, which AMD were debated into increasing with a BIOS update a week before launch, then that's probably not a major reason why. If AMD can simply increase clock speeds by 10% with a BIOS update, that means that they were deliberately sandbagging that card, and they hoped that Nvidia wouldn't try to compete. Nvidia did compete by lowering the price of the 2060. But to the main point, when it comes to increasing voltages in order to bin cards into higher speed bins, that just doesn't appear to be the most likely case. It would surely be far smarter to bin the top bins like the 5700 XT much more aggressively, and then get superior performance per watt for that card. And then all those bad bins, you simply use them in the 5700s and this 5600 XT, sacrificing so much power draw on all 5700 XTs just to get a few more highest bin chips on a wafer. That seems like an absurd decision, relatively. I was told the real reason for the high stock voltages was in order to keep card stability over longer periods. My initial reaction was to ask, why does this not seem to be affecting Nvidia? However, no answer was forthcoming on that, except for we know that Nvidia has exceptional performance per watt. Silicon degradation is a thing, and it gets worse at lower nanometers. Essentially, each GPU or CPU, regardless of the quality of the silicon, has to be capable of sustaining error-free operation at the given clock speeds and voltages for the product. So the Radeon 7 reference card needs to be capable of running at up to 1800 MHz at 1100 millivolts for as long as the warranty lasts. In the case of the reference 7, that is actually only 1 year. However, if you're in Europe at least, you're automatically covered for 3 years. So really, the cards need to maintain stability for an absolute minimum of 3 years. Continuous operation, maxed out. And this is completely overkill for gamers, clearly. But I'll get to that point soon. The Radeon Technologies Group is definitely playing it ultra safe on voltages though. I don't game a huge amount these days, and when I do, I also run with Radeon Chill as default, which will of course help to prolong the life of my card. But even after 1 year of gaming on that card, I can undervolt my Radeon 7 to 1000 millivolts and run Furmark's GPU burn-in test, and this will run for hours and days without any problems whatsoever. And eventually under Furmark the card will hit 81 degrees, even with 100 millivolt undervolt. So this is a real test of the card's stability. And you can maybe hear the fans ramping up a bit now. Obviously, I'm not saying that the card should ship at 1000 millivolts, but 1050 instead of 1100 seems more than reasonable to me. And we saw in the case of my card, as I mentioned, the automatic undervolt selects 1040 millivolts. What are the chances of the chip degrading so much over 3 years that 1050 millivolts isn't more than enough, even with intensive gaming many hours per day. And during my Radeon 7 review, that automatic undervolt actually only dropped the card to 1050 millivolts back then, and that was enough to drop the fan speed by around 600 revs per minute. The difference in noise was very clear. By then I was starting to evolve my ideas. If degradation over time is the main worry, why not just start off at 1050 millivolts and then increase it by 10 millivolts every, say, 6 months, or a year even? This can easily be done in the driver. An alternative idea came to me while I was watching for Mark. Why not just slightly decrease the clock speed over time instead? Now, I realise that many of you wouldn't like that option, as nobody wants to lose performance. But if you check the clock speeds on the Radeon 7 at least, it doesn't hold 1800 MHz, and in fact barely even reaches that peak. This 1800 is an up to. They call it the peak engine clock, and AMD might have the legal right to lower clock speeds over time in order to maintain stability. Not sure about that. And you probably remember that Apple got sued for doing something similar when they chose to lower performance in order to maintain their battery life. The difference here though is that the Radeon Technologies Group would likely be increasing performance of their cards over time, not decreasing. You very likely remember the Polaris PCIe fiasco, where they went over the motherboard PCIe slot allowance by around about 5 watts. And that was enough for the tech press to be in an uproar. AMD quickly hurried out a fix for that particular issue within days. 3 days, I think. And at the same time, they introduced this compatibility mode, which lowered power by quite a lot in fact. That's nearly 20 watts. But what was interesting about this was that even with this pretty large drop in power, the performance was virtually unchanged. The blue bar compared to the black, it is slightly lower in every case apart from Rise of the Tomb Raider, but the differences are so small as to be basically academic. How is that possible? How could they drop 20 watts of power and yet keep performance the same? And the answer was that they also had some game driver updates coming for Polaris in the next driver, but instead decided to add them to this emergency fix. Compatibility mode did reduce the performance of the card, but the game performance remained about the same, and obviously with further driver updates to Polaris over the years, overall performance was guaranteed to increase over time. While I highly doubt they would take that option, lowering clock speeds over time could be another way around this hot and loud thing, rather than increasing voltages over time. But finally, after going through all this process, I figured that surely the real reason for this huge out-of-the-box voltage was for people using the cards under heavy compute loads, like for example mining. The thing about miners though is, the first thing they do is they undervolt and downclock the cards in order to find the performance per watt sweet spot. So ramping up the voltage shouldn't be a concern to AMD, at least not for miners. And if you recall, AMD used to also have 2 different modes in the driver. They had this GPU workload setting where you could choose either graphics or compute. I've got no idea what changes these made, and for some reason this no longer seems to be part of the new Adrenalin software suite. But it got me thinking, if compute loads are the reason for such high stock voltages, because AMD wants 100% guaranteed stability for 3 years at 1800 MHz 24/7 compute work, then why not bring this back and set compute mode to 1100 millivolts and the graphics mode at say 1050. Nobody games 24 hours a day, so the chances of you wearing your graphics card out so that 1050 millivolts is no longer enough to maintain 1800 MHz, it must be vanishingly small. And yeah, I get that some people game and mine, or they game and do some compute work, but really, what percentage of people are we talking about here who basically have their graphics cards flat out 24/7 for years on end? And here's the thing. Surely by undervolting the card for graphics mode means that longevity will increase, not decrease. So let's end this video with a recap of the options which I presented. Number 1 was lowering the voltage in the press driver and not telling the press. Clearly that is sneaky and anti-consumer. However, I think I have shown that they would have got away with it. And even if somebody noticed, then they have plenty of plausible deniability. They just say it was a bug in the press driver. Option number 2 was to lower the voltage in the press driver while telling the press in the reviewer guide But I was actually told that this is what may be an option for the Radeon Technologies Group. However, as I said, that option will not work, and in fact, it will just blow up in their faces. Option number 3 was to start the voltages 50 millivolts lower and increase them by 10 millivolts every 6 months or so. This would have the effect of the card getting hotter and louder over time though. However, the first impression, the review impression, would be much better. Again, somewhat sneaky and a little bit anti-consumer. The fourth option was to start the voltages 50 millivolts lower and very slightly reduce the clock speed in each driver release where performance improvements are made, so that no actual performance is lost. The problem with 3 and 4 is that not everybody updates their drivers, so there would be a risk of their card failing to maintain its stability over 3 years. A very small risk, I have to say. However, I actually find that extremely unlikely as well, as anybody doing enough gaming to matter is surely updating their drivers. But just to make sure, they could automatically update it through Windows. And option number 5 was to bring back compute mode and have different voltages set for gaming and compute loads. If, as I suspect is the case, the reason for such high stock voltages in the first place is because they need to maintain stability for years under these very heavy compute loads, 24/7. I'm not saying that any of these solutions are perfect, but it has to be better than doing nothing. And look, I am not a microprocessor engineer, but it seems to me that the Radeon Technologies Group just isn't trying to fix this problem, because it appears that doing nothing is a lazy option which RTG has chosen. I've had a proper look through this RX 5600 XT reviewer's guide, and there was no mention of automatic undervolt being the default setting. And in fact, there is still no mention, and there has never been any mention of the automatic undervolt feature in any of the press materials 1 year after the feature was introduced. And you know, Big Navi is looking great, but if it's yet another hot and loud, then just take the smart options for once, RTG. You do have options, but you're just not using any of them. And I'm done with this one. The reason this video is late, I picked up a really irritating hand injury, which looks like ulnar nerve entrapment, and I developed this after falling asleep on my left arm. This was well over a week ago now. The symptoms are identical to what I've read up on, and it's actually not going away, so I'm going to have to visit the doctor to start the healing process. I'm able to type, but it is extremely irritating and painful having this constant feeling of pins and needles in these 2 fingers here. But it's been quite a long and pretty tough video to get finished for me. As always though, don't forget to check out the website and also the new AdoredTV web YouTube channel, where Kirk and Matthew from the website have released a couple of podcasts. The audio wasn't fantastic in the first one, it was really just their first run, but it's improved an awful lot in the second and should continue to improve over time. And I'll be back with another video as soon as I can, and I'll catch you later guys.